frozen bear cub found shivering on a riverbank. What its mother does next amazes rescuers. The snowflakes drifted down like delicate whispers from the sky, swirling around Emily Foster as she made her way through the dense woods of the Chippewa National Forest. The air was thick with the chill of winter, biting at her exposed cheeks and numbing her fingers. Every breath she took was sharp, cold, but somehow invigorating, a reminder that life could still exist even in the harshest conditions. The trees around her stood like sentinels, their bare branches reaching out like skeletal arms against the gray sky. There was a certain beauty in the silence, in the way the forest seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Emily had been a forest ranger here for nearly a decade, but there was always something new to discover in this vast, unspoiled wilderness. Every crackling twig underfoot, every rustling leaf, every bird call, it was all part of the wild dance she had come to love. It was the same forest she had known since she was a child, yet it never failed to offer up fresh experiences, new challenges, and moments of quiet introspection. But today, as she walked along the frozen banks of the Mississippi River, something felt different. The wind howled through the pines, and the snow, now thick underfoot, seemed to make the world feel even quieter. Emily's boots crunched through the snow with each step, her eyes scanning the woods for any sign of movement. She had heard that a few bears were still active this late in the season, fattening up before hibernation. The thought of the bears reminded her of her mother, who had been a wildlife biologist. Emily could remember so vividly the way her mother would speak about the resilience of bears, how they survived, even thrived, in conditions that would crush lesser creatures. Her mother had passed away 3 winters ago, leaving behind a hole in Emily's heart that no amount of work or time could fill. Since then, the forests had become both her refuge and her burden. It was in these woods that she found solace, but it was also in the deep silence of the trees that she confronted her grief. In nature, she saw herself reflected, the strong, enduring presence of the forest, but also the fragility of life. As she rounded a bend in the riverbank, something caught her eye. It was small, too small to be a bear, too still to be anything she had seen before. Emily's heart quickened as she approached. There, nestled against the icy shore of the river, was a tiny form. At first, she thought it might be a bird, a squirrel, or something else she could not immediately identify. But as she got closer, the form revealed itself to be something far more urgent, a bear cub shivering in the snow. Her breath caught in her throat. The cub was barely moving, its small body trembling from the cold, its eyes barely open, its fur matted and damp from the freezing river water that had splashed onto its pelt. The scene was heartbreaking. Emily's thoughts raced. Where was the mother? Had it fallen from the den? How long had it been out here, vulnerable to the elements, all alone? Instinctively, Emily dropped to her knees beside the cub, her hands trembling as she assessed the situation. She could feel the cold biting at her skin, but it was the cub's feeble condition that made her forget the chill in the air. The cub was so young, its fur thin, its breathing shallow. It was clear that it had been out here for too long, too weak to survive without help. Without thinking twice, Emily gently scooped the cub into her arms, cradling its small body close to her chest, trying to shield it from the cold. She could feel its heartbeat, rapid and weak, against her skin. The cub's fur was damp, and its little claws dug into her gloves as it tried to find warmth. Emily's mind raced as she stood up and turned back toward the ranger station. She knew she couldn't leave it here, not with the river so close, not with the temperature dropping by the hour. "Hang on, little one," she whispered, her voice soft but firm, a quiet promise she wasn't sure she could keep. With her arms wrapped around the cub, she made her way back through the snow, her heart heavy with a mix of determination and uncertainty. The walk back to the station felt like an eternity, the weight of the tiny bear cub in her arms a reminder of her responsibility. As she trudged through the snow, her thoughts flickered back to her mother's teachings. Bears were resilient, she had said, but even the strongest creatures could falter if they were not given the help they needed. When Emily finally arrived at the ranger station, she was out of breath, and her body ached from the cold. She gently laid the cub down on a warm blanket in the station's small treatment area, fumbling with the supplies as she hurried to tend to its needs. She checked its temperature, feeling an overwhelming sense of helplessness settle over her like a heavy fog. There was a deep wound in the cub's side, likely from an encounter with something sharp, a branch perhaps, or the jagged rocks along the riverbank. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was serious. Emily set to work immediately, cleaning the wound with careful hands, making sure the cub was warm and fed, and covering it with every blanket she could find. The cub barely stirred, but Emily could feel the rise and fall of its chest, the tiny breaths that kept it alive. She didn't dare leave its side, not for a moment. Every so often, she'd glance out the window, hoping against hope that the mother would come, that she would appear out of the woods, guiding the cub back home. But the hours dragged on, and still, there was no sign of the bear. The night stretched out before her, quiet and tense, filled with the sound of the wind howling outside. Emily stared at the cub, her eyes tired, her heart heavy. She had done everything she could, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, that this wasn't how it was supposed to be. Had she taken the cub from its mother too soon? She couldn't help but wonder. Sitting beside the cub, Emily felt the weight of her own loneliness pressing down on her shoulders. The solitude of the forest had always been comforting, but tonight, it felt different. Tonight, the silence seemed unbearable, filled with all the things left unsaid, all the moments she had missed. She gazed out the window again, half hoping for a sign, half dreading what she might find. But the night remained still, and still, the cub breathed. The cub's tiny body rose and fell in a shallow rhythm, its breaths unsteady. Every now and then, Emily would reach out, her fingers brushing against its cold fur, reassuring herself that it was still alive. She had given it a few small sips of water, hoping to help it regain strength, but the cub was too weak to drink much. She wasn't sure if it was the cold, the injury, or just the shock of being alone in such a harsh world that had left the cub in such a fragile state. It felt so wrong to have taken the cub from its natural habitat, but there had been no other choice. Emily had seen firsthand the dangers of the forest during the winter months. Bears were built for the cold, yes, but a young cub, alone, separated from its mother, it stood little chance against the elements or the predators that roamed the woods. She exhaled a long, tired breath and glanced out the window, watching the falling snow outside. The world seemed so still. The quiet of the forest was all-encompassing, but tonight, it felt almost oppressive. The stillness in the station was just a reflection of the stillness in her heart, and the weight of everything that had been left unsaid between her and the wilderness pressed down on her shoulders. Her thoughts drifted, not for the first time, to her mother. Emily's hands stilled for a moment as she recalled how, as a child, her mother had been her guide to the forest, showing her the delicate balance of nature, the strength of the trees, the resilience of the animals, the unspoken rhythm that pulsed beneath the surface of it all. Emily had grown up hearing stories about the forest cycles, its quiet beauty, its harshness, and its silent way of offering both comfort and challenge. But her mother was gone now, taken by a sudden illness that no amount of medicine could prevent, leaving Emily alone in the woods. There was so much she had never said to her mother, so much she had never been able to ask. She wondered sometimes if her mother had felt the same deep connection to the forest that Emily now did, a pull that seemed both comforting and suffocating. The wilderness had always been her mother's refuge, and now, in her absence, it had become Emily's. But tonight, the wilderness felt different. It felt cold and distant, just as the rest of the world had in the last few years. The cub's small whine interrupted her thoughts, bringing her back to the present. She looked down at the little creature, its eyes fluttering open for a moment. Its tiny paws were curled up close to its chest, its fragile body still trembling slightly despite the warmth of the blankets. "I'm here," Emily murmured softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. She stroked the cub's head gently, the tips of her fingers brushing over its soft fur. "You're safe now. I won't leave you." She watched the cub for a moment longer, torn between the need to do something, anything, to help and the quiet realization that all she could do was wait. The cub's fate, like her own, hung in the balance. The forest had its own rhythm, its own pace, and sometimes, no matter how hard you tried, you couldn't change it. Emily felt the tension in her chest release slightly as she closed her eyes, leaning back in the chair. There was a sense of stillness in the room now, a deep kind of quiet that reminded her of the peace she used to feel in the forest. But it was a different kind of peace now, one that came with acceptance, with the knowledge that some things in life couldn't be fixed by sheer willpower. She glanced at the window again, the darkened world outside blurred by the steady snowfall. She had heard stories from the older rangers, tales of mothers who ventured far and wide to find their lost cubs, of creatures who endured the harshest winters to ensure the survival of their young. It was a lesson in resilience, in survival. But in the quiet of the ranger station, surrounded by the warmth and security of civilization, Emily was reminded of how fragile that survival could be. She thought again about the mother bear. Where was she now? Was she out there somewhere in the dark, searching for her cub? Had Emily made a mistake by removing the cub from its natural environment? It was hard not to question her choices, but even more difficult to reconcile the fear that had gripped her when she had found the cub alone, shivering, so small and helpless. She couldn't have left it to die. That much she knew for sure. A soft breeze rattled the windows as the wind picked up outside, signaling the arrival of another storm. Emily stood up, stretching her stiff limbs, and moved toward the small desk in the corner of the room. The cub's quiet breaths were the only sound that filled the space, and the stillness had a weight to it, pressing down on her like a blanket. She reached for a notebook, flipping it open to a blank page. Her mother had always kept journals, filled with observations about the forest, the animals, and the changing seasons. Emily had never fully appreciated the way her mother had written about the world, so methodically, so attuned to the rhythm of the earth. But now, she found herself following in her mother's footsteps, scribbling down her thoughts as if doing so would somehow help make sense of it all. The cub is small, cold. I've done all I can for now. Where is the mother? Has she been looking for her? The forest is harsh, but it is also home. This is what my mother would have said. It is both life and death, struggle and survival. Emily paused, her pen hovering over the page. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, a quiet reminder of the wisdom she had inherited. Life, like the forest, wasn't always easy. It wasn't always fair. But there was always a way forward, even in the face of hardship. She closed the notebook, staring down at the cub once more. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Emily felt a flicker of hope, small but undeniable. This cub, like her, was fighting to survive. She wasn't alone. Not really. The night stretched on, but Emily's mind had settled. There was nothing more to do now but wait for the storm to pass, wait for the next steps to reveal themselves, just as the forest had always done in its own time. And in that quiet, enduring stillness, Emily felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The wilderness wasn't just a place of solitude. It was a place of connection, a place where resilience was born from the most unlikely of circumstances. The wind howled again, but Emily no longer felt alone. Not in the forest. Not in the world. The first rays of light pierced the gray clouds the next morning, casting a soft glow over the snow-covered world outside. Emily had not slept well. Despite the warmth of the ranger station and the sense of security it offered, every creak of the wooden beams, every gust of wind against the windows, pulled her from the fragile veil of sleep. But it wasn't just the restlessness of the night that had kept her awake, it was the quiet, nagging worry that gnawed at her throughout the hours. She had done what she could. But in the stillness of the early morning, as the world outside seemed to stretch and breathe, she felt the weight of her decision press down upon her more than ever. Had she done the right thing? Was she supposed to step in, or had she robbed this cub of its chance to return to the wild? Was she, in some way, denying the natural order? The cub had shown no signs of improvement through the night. Its breaths were still shallow, its little body trembling under the weight of the blankets. But there had been moments, brief, fleeting moments, when Emily thought it had gained a little more strength. When it shifted slightly in its sleep or when it let out a soft whimper in response to her touch. But for now, it was still fragile, still in need of care, and Emily felt her heart tug at every small sign of vulnerability it displayed. She had learned much about the strength of the wild over the years. Her mother had often spoken about it, how animals, even in their most vulnerable moments, carried a strength that could not be measured. Emily knew that bears, especially mothers, were fiercely protective of their young. They would do anything to ensure their cubs survived, even in the most unforgiving of conditions. But that was all just theory. What would happen in reality? What if the mother had already given up? What if Emily's decision had robbed both the cub and the mother of what they needed most, a chance at survival? The thought was unbearable. Emily couldn't bear to look at the cub again, so small, so helpless, as if it were a symbol of all the things she couldn't control in her own life. She stared out the window, the morning light now pouring through the glass and illuminating the snow outside. It was beautiful. But in the stillness of the moment, it felt distant, removed from everything Emily had once known. The cub stirred on the blanket beside her, a faint sound escaping its throat, pulling her from her thoughts. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She stood up slowly, her legs stiff from the long hours spent sitting next to the cub, and moved toward it. Its eyes were open now, though still glazed with the weariness of the night. But there was a small spark in its gaze, a flicker of life that hadn't been there before. It was enough to make Emily's breath catch in her throat. She knelt beside the cub, carefully placing a hand on its small body. The warmth beneath her fingers reassured her, even if just for a moment. It wasn't much, but it was something. She was doing the right thing, wasn't she? But as Emily watched the cub, her mind couldn't quiet the restless thoughts. What if the mother didn't come? What if this wasn't the way nature had intended? Suddenly, a sound reached her ears, a rustle from outside the station. A faint, low growl sent a shiver down her spine. The cub stirred again, its ears twitching at the unfamiliar sound. Emily froze, holding her breath. Her heart raced as she moved quietly to the window, her eyes scanning the snowy expanse beyond. The wind had picked up again, swirling the snow in unpredictable gusts, but something in her gut told her that it was no ordinary breeze. She had heard something, someone was out there. She peered out, the quiet of the forest now amplified by the anticipation building in her chest. The trees swayed, their branches creaking under the weight of the snow, but there was no movement. She let out a breath, almost relieved. Then, a figure emerged from the tree line, a dark shape moving slowly, purposefully through the snow. Emily's heart stopped. It was a bear, a large one, its thick fur dusted with snow, its massive form cutting through the cold like a force of nature. For a long moment, Emily couldn't move. She watched as the bear approached the clearing in front of the station, her eyes locked on the animal's steady, purposeful gait. There was no hesitation, no fear in the way she moved. She was a creature of the wild, of the forest, and she knew exactly where she was going. Emily could hardly breathe. It was as though time had slowed, the entire world holding its breath in anticipation. The bear reached the edge of the clearing and stopped, her massive head turning slightly, eyes scanning the station as if she could sense something. Emily's body tensed, her heart racing, but she didn't dare make a sound. Then, in a slow, deliberate movement, the mother bear began to move toward the ranger station, her steps measured, each one carrying her closer to the warmth and security of the building. Emily didn't know what to do. Part of her wanted to rush outside and try to call the bear back, but she knew she couldn't. She couldn't interfere now, not when the mother had found her way here, not when the connection between them had been made. The cub's eyes widened, and it let out a soft whimper in response to the approaching sound. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The mother bear was here. She had come with a strength that seemed to resonate from the earth itself. The mother bear approached the station door, her nose twitching as she sniffed the air. Emily felt a deep pang of emotion, a mixture of awe and respect for the animal's instinct, its determination. The wilderness was relentless, but it was also full of life, of purpose, of connection. Emily stepped back from the window, not wanting to disturb the moment. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood, uncertain of what to do next. Should she go out and greet the mother, try to reunite them? Would the mother accept the cub back, or had it been too long? The cub stirred again, its eyes searching the room, its small body trembling slightly. It let out a low, weak cry, and then, as though guided by some invisible thread, the mother bear lifted her head, letting out a low, deep rumble that echoed through the station. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the cub responded with a soft, desperate whimper. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them, the mother and the cub. It was a bond that transcended language, transcended time, a connection as old as the forest itself. The mother bear took a step closer to the door, and Emily knew what she had to do. She gently opened the door. The cold hit her instantly, the winter air sharp against her face, but she didn't hesitate. The mother bear stood just outside the threshold, her eyes locked on her cub. Emily moved aside, allowing the two to meet. The cub let out a soft cry, and the mother bear answered with a low growl of reassurance, her massive body lowering to nuzzle the small form of her cub. In that moment, Emily watched as the forest's power and grace came alive. She had done what she could, but this was the moment when nature itself took control. The mother had returned, and in that quiet, profound reunion, Emily understood some things were meant to be left untouched. She wasn't the one who could heal this cub. The wilderness had its own way of restoring balance, and all she had to do was witness it. As she closed the door, standing alone in the soft light of the station, Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. The storm outside continued, but inside there was peace, a peace that came from knowing, finally, that she was no longer alone in her journey. The wilderness had a way of making you feel both small and significant at the same time, and in that vast, quiet forest, Emily finally understood her place in it. The days that followed the cub's return to its mother passed with a quietude that seemed almost unnatural in its peace. The storm that had swept through the forest had left the trees bent low under heavy snow, the river frozen solid, and the air still with the weight of winter's grip. But Emily felt a subtle shift within herself, a change that mirrored the changing season. Every morning since the bear's return, Emily had risen with the light, the early dawn casting long shadows across the station. The cub's reunion with its mother had been nothing short of a miracle, but it had also been a lesson, one she hadn't quite fully understood until now. There had been so much uncertainty, so much fear in her heart, but in the end, nature had taken its course. The mother bear had found her cub, guided by instinct and strength. And in that moment, Emily had learned something she hadn't known she needed to learn, that sometimes, all you can do is step back and allow things to unfold. Emily found herself standing at the window of the ranger station each morning, watching the soft light shift across the snow. It had become a ritual, one that grounded her in a way nothing else could. She had always been a part of this forest, but after the cub's rescue, she felt something deeper, a connection she hadn't realized had been missing. The forest, once a place of isolation, now felt like a community, a vast, living thing that was both unpredictable and constant. She had begun to notice things in the woods that she hadn't before, the way the light caught the icicles hanging from the branches, how the tracks of animals were preserved in the fresh snow, the distant cry of a hawk that sounded like a whisper on the wind. Everything around her seemed to hold meaning now. She could feel her mother's presence in these moments, the lessons she had passed down without even realizing it. How to read the sky, how to track the animals, how to listen. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about connection with the forest, with the creatures who lived in it, and with herself. That afternoon, Emily packed a small bag and set off into the woods again, her boots crunching against the frozen ground as she made her way through the trees. Her movements were deliberate, the air crisp against her face, the silence around her stretching out like a deep breath. She knew the trail she was following. It was the same one she had taken so many times. But today, it felt different. Today, she wasn't just walking for the sake of walking. She was walking with purpose, with intention, with a deep sense of understanding that she hadn't had before. As she made her way to the clearing by the riverbank, the place where she had found the cub only days before, she noticed the subtle changes winter had brought. The ice had grown thicker, the snow deeper. But it was the stillness that caught her attention most of all. The air felt charged with quiet energy, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. Emily stood for a moment at the riverbank, watching the frozen water stretch out before her. The sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, casting the entire scene in a soft, golden light. It was beautiful, almost too much to take in. She knelt down, brushing the snow from a large rock, and sat there for a while, simply listening. The wind rustled through the trees, and in the distance, she could hear the faint sound of a bird call, soft, distant, but real. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing the forest to surround her, feeling the earth beneath her, the weight of the snow on the branches above her. There was something grounding in this moment, something that reminded her of the strength that lay deep within the wilderness. In that stillness, Emily felt the truth that had been hiding all along. Her place in this world, in this forest, was not just about protecting it. It was about belonging to it, about being part of the same rhythm, the same cycle of life. She had always been part of it, whether she had realized it or not. The forest had always been a part of her, just as much as she was a part of it. As Emily stood and made her way back toward the ranger station, the snow began to fall again in soft, delicate flurries. She felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The cub was safe, the mother had returned, and the forest, as it always did, had shown her the way. There was still much to learn and many more lessons to come, but for the first time in a long while, Emily knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The next few days were marked by a quiet kind of change, subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. Winter had started to loosen its grip on the forest. Though the snow still blanketed the land in a thick white layer, the days were longer now, and the sun, when it peeked through the clouds, held a warmth that hinted at the coming thaw. It was as if the forest, too, was preparing for the shift that would soon be upon it, just as Emily was preparing for her own transformation, one she had yet to fully comprehend. The cabin was warmer now as the stove crackled with a steady fire, its flames licking the wood with a soft, persistent hunger. Emily spent more time indoors than usual, not out of necessity, but because there was a kind of peacefulness in the solitude. It gave her space to think, to reflect, to reorient herself in the wake of the bear cub's rescue. She often found herself gazing out the window, watching the trees sway gently in the wind, their branches still heavy with the weight of snow. But as the days passed, Emily began to notice something she hadn't seen before, a shift in the way the forest responded to her presence. The sounds seemed clearer, more distinct. The calls of birds reached her from farther away, the rustle of leaves more audible, the whispers of the wind more personal. It was as if the woods, which had once felt like a place of detachment, had opened up to her, inviting her to witness its life in a deeper way. Her connection to the forest was no longer just a professional bond, it had become something more intimate. The land, the trees, the animals, they were no longer just subjects of her work. They were companions, quietly teaching her about resilience, about survival, about what it meant to endure. She found herself thinking more deeply about the lives of the creatures she protected, realizing that the survival of each one was a delicate, fragile thing. Yet within that fragility, there was a strength that defied comprehension. That morning, as Emily stood at the window looking out over the frozen expanse of the forest, she saw something that made her pause, a movement near the tree line. She squinted, her heart quickening as she recognized the familiar form of the mother bear. The bear was moving slowly, deliberately, and as Emily watched, she realized the bear was not alone. The cub was with her, trotting along beside her, its small body still clumsy but clearly gaining strength with each passing day. A feeling washed over Emily, one she couldn't quite put into words, a mixture of pride and awe, something deeply satisfying, as if she had witnessed a miracle unfolding before her eyes. The mother had not only found her cub, but she had stayed with it, guided it, and now they were moving forward together, side by side. The cub was growing stronger, learning to navigate the world around it under the watchful eye of its mother. The bond between them was undeniable, one that nature had forged and would continue to nurture in the coming months. Emily smiled softly to herself, her hand resting lightly on the window pane. There was a certain beauty in watching them, in knowing that, despite everything, the forest had not just survived, it was thriving. The bear family, so resilient, so full of life, was a reminder of the quiet power of nature, of the endless cycles of birth and death, of growth and decay. There was no rushing it, no fighting it. The forest would continue, with or without her. But in this moment, Emily felt a sense of peace, peace in knowing that she had been part of something greater than herself. She stayed by the window for a while longer, watching as the mother and cub disappeared into the woods. The cub still looked small, fragile even, but there was a fire in its eyes, a spark of something that would carry it through the seasons to come. And as the sight of them faded from view, Emily knew the forest was teaching her something she hadn't fully understood until now. She wasn't meant to control the wild, she was meant to observe it, to learn from it, to protect it when necessary. But beyond that, she had to let it be what it was, unpredictable, raw, and wild. There was beauty in its imperfection. There was strength in its quiet, steady pulse. And for the first time, Emily felt at peace with that. Later that day, Emily packed her supplies and headed out into the forest again. The landscape had changed subtly since she had last walked this path, but it was still familiar, the same trees, the same winding river that cut its way through the land. Yet today, it felt different. She walked slower, more deliberately, her eyes scanning the forest not just for signs of wildlife but for something deeper, something she couldn't quite put into words. The weight of her past, the grief of losing her mother, the feeling of being lost within herself, had always felt heavy, like a burden she couldn't shake. But now, as she walked beneath the trees, that burden felt lighter. Not because the past had gone away, but because she had come to accept it. It was as though the forest, in its infinite wisdom, had taught her that some things had to be embraced, accepted for what they were, before true healing could begin. She stopped at the edge of the river, the same spot where she had found the cub only days ago. The water was still frozen, though the edges were beginning to thaw, and the snow had softened slightly, making it easier to walk. She crouched by the water's edge, watching the reflections in the ice, the way the trees bent above her, their branches heavy with snow. And for the first time in years, Emily felt something stir within her, a sense of connection, not just to the forest, but to herself. The cub had been a catalyst for this change. Its fragility, its vulnerability, had reminded her of her own fragility, and in turn, had made her realize how much strength there was in accepting that vulnerability. The cub, despite its fear, had found its mother. And Emily, despite her own fear, had found her place in the world, too. As she sat there by the river, the soft wind brushing against her face, Emily realized something else. The forest had never been a place to escape, it had always been a place to return to. It had been there, waiting for her, just as it had been there for her mother. It was home. And for the first time, she felt like she was finally home. The sun was setting now, casting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Emily stood up, brushing the snow off her knees, and started the journey back to the station. There was much more to learn, more to experience. But for now, she was content. The forest had shown her that sometimes, the greatest strength lies in letting go. And sometimes, the most profound growth comes not from pushing forward, but from simply being. And so, as Emily made her way back, she carried with her the quiet assurance that no matter what lay ahead, she would face it with the same resilience she had seen in the forest itself. And that was enough. The forest had shifted with the seasons, and with each passing day, Emily felt the change within herself as well. The harshness of winter was slowly receding, giving way to the promise of spring. The snow began to melt at the edges of the river, creating pools of water that reflected the soft morning light. The air smelled of earth and fresh pine, and though the wind still carried a bite, there was something else now, something lighter, something full of possibility. It was the first morning in weeks when Emily didn't feel the familiar weight of her grief pressing down on her chest. For the first time, she woke to the sound of birdsong rather than silence, the world outside her window alive with the quiet hum of renewal. She felt a connection to this newness, a resonance deep inside her that called her to step outside, to meet the day as it unfolded. She stood by the window for a while, watching the sunlight slowly fill the forest. Its golden rays filtered through the trees. The snow had turned from white to pale blue, and in the distance, Emily could see the faint movement of the mother bear and her cub. They were far off, but the sight was enough to stir something within her, hope, perhaps, or even a kind of quiet joy. The bear and her cub had found their way through the winter, and now they were stepping into the promise of spring. They had survived. They had endured. And so too had Emily. It wasn't just that she had made it through the past months or that she had weathered the storm of grief and loss. It was something more, something she couldn't quite name yet. She had found a way to embrace the silence, to embrace the waiting, to see the beauty in the struggle. The forest had shown her that growth wasn't always immediate. It wasn't always loud. Sometimes, it came quietly, slowly, like the thawing of the river or the first buds on the trees. Emily moved toward the door, stepping outside into the cool air. The ground beneath her feet was softening, the snow giving way to patches of earth that had been hidden for months. The scent of wet pine and damp leaves filled her senses as she walked through the clearing toward the edge of the river. The world felt both fragile and powerful, like it was holding its breath, waiting for the next chapter to begin. As she walked, Emily thought about how far she had come. The cub had shown her so much about resilience, about the strength that could be found in vulnerability. It had taught her that survival wasn't about being invincible. It was about perseverance, about the quiet courage to keep going when everything seemed uncertain. The cub had fought for its life, but so had she. And now, they were both standing on the threshold of something new. The riverbank was quiet, save for the occasional rustling of branches in the breeze. Emily sat on a large rock, letting her feet dip into the cold water that was beginning to flow more freely with the melting snow. She closed her eyes, letting the sound of the water fill her ears, the gentle rush of it, almost like a lullaby. It had been so long since she had taken a moment for herself, longer still since she had felt truly present in the world around her. There had always been so much to do, so many responsibilities, so many expectations. But now, here in the quiet of the forest, Emily could simply be. It felt like a luxury, one she hadn't realized she needed so badly. The sense of stillness was profound, but it wasn't the kind of stillness that felt oppressive like it had in the past. It was the stillness of acceptance, of being at peace with the world as it was, without needing to change it. She had spent so much time resisting the flow of life, trying to control everything around her. But the forest, the bear, the cub, they had shown her that sometimes, the key to growth was surrender. Sometimes, you had to trust the process. Trust that the seasons would change in their own time, just as her heart had begun to change in its own time. As the sunlight grew warmer, the first buds of spring began to appear, dotting the edges of the forest. Tiny flowers, pale and delicate, pushed their way through the soil, their petals trembling in the breeze. The sight of them brought a soft smile to Emily's face. She reached down and gently touched one of the blossoms, its fragile petals brushing against her fingertips. It seemed almost impossible that something so delicate could survive the harshness of winter. But here it was, alive, blossoming, defying the odds. She realized in that moment that she was much like the flower. She had spent so many years in the shadow of grief and uncertainty, feeling small and insignificant in a world that seemed so vast and unyielding. But now, in this moment, she understood that there was strength in fragility, that survival didn't mean hardness. It meant openness. It meant the willingness to reach for the light, even when the world around you seemed cold and barren. Emily stood up slowly, feeling the weight of her body shifting, the muscles in her legs moving with more confidence than they had in a long time. She turned back toward the ranger station, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. There were still challenges ahead, still moments of doubt and fear to face. But now, she knew that she had the strength to meet them, not with resistance, but with acceptance. The forest had taught her that sometimes, the most powerful thing you could do was to simply allow. Allow yourself to be. Allow yourself to grow. And allow the world to unfold at its own pace. She paused before entering the cabin, her gaze drifting back toward the river. The mother bear and her cub were visible again, farther up the riverbank, moving together as one. Emily's heart swelled with quiet joy at the sight of them, knowing that their journey was far from over, but they were moving forward, together. And so was she. As Emily stepped inside the cabin, she was filled with a new sense of purpose. She didn't know exactly what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't need to. The forest had shown her that sometimes, the path forward wasn't about knowing where you were going. It was about trusting the journey itself. With that, she smiled to herself, a quiet, satisfied smile that was more than just contentment. It was peace. And for the first time in years, it felt like home. As spring continued to stretch its limbs across the forest, Emily's days became more and more intertwined with the rhythms of the world around her. The forest, once an endless expanse of cold and silence, was now alive, full of movement, of sound, of new life. Birds returned to the trees, their calls bright and clear, and the undergrowth slowly gave way to green shoots reaching for the sun. The air was filled with the scent of fresh pine and damp earth, and with it, the promise of rebirth. But Emily, despite all the beauty surrounding her, couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in her too. It wasn't just the forest coming back to life. It was her coming back to life too. The shadows of the past, which had once seemed so long and heavy, had begun to fade, replaced by the quiet strength she had uncovered deep inside. And for the first time, she realized that the grief she had carried for so long was not something she needed to carry forever. It was something that could be set down, slowly, piece by piece. She spent most of her days walking the trails she knew so well, watching as the world transformed before her eyes. The bear and her cub were often seen foraging in the underbrush, making their way along the riverbanks. And Emily couldn't help but marvel at how much the cub had grown. Its once fragile steps had turned sure, its body now sturdy, its coat thickening against the chill that still clung to the air. Watching them was a daily reminder of resilience, of survival, of how the smallest things could grow into the strongest. One morning, as Emily ventured deeper into the woods, she stumbled across something she hadn't expected, a small broken branch near a clearing. At first, she thought nothing of it. But then she saw it, the unmistakable tracks of the bear cub. The soft prints in the snow led off into the forest. They were fresh, the prints still sharp and well-formed. It wasn't long before Emily realized the tracks were leading toward the tree line. Her pulse quickened. The mother and cub had become such a presence in her life, and she found herself more concerned about their well-being than ever before. She followed the tracks, walking more carefully now, the sounds of the forest growing quieter as she neared the spot where the tracks seemed to converge. And then, there they were. The mother bear stood on the edge of the clearing, watching Emily with steady, unblinking eyes. Her gaze was calm, assessing, but there was no sign of aggression. Emily took a step forward, her movement slow, as the cub emerged from behind the mother's massive frame. The cub, now noticeably larger and more agile, paused for a moment before moving to its mother's side. The two shared a look, a silent communication that only they understood. Emily smiled softly, taking in the scene before her. It was the same bond she had seen before, the fierce protectiveness of the mother, the tentative curiosity of the cub. It was a reminder that life was cyclical, that the forest operated on its own time, on its own terms. The forest had its seasons, just as Emily had her own. And like the bear, she had learned to move forward even in the face of uncertainty, even through the coldest nights. The mother bear let out a low grunt, breaking Emily from her thoughts. Then, with a deliberate turn, she led her cub deeper into the woods, her movements purposeful. Emily stood there for a long time, watching them disappear into the shadows of the trees before finally letting out a quiet breath and turning to make her way back to the station. In the following weeks, Emily found herself doing more than just observing the forest. She was part of it now, woven into its fabric. She had stopped trying to make sense of everything, stopped thinking that there was always a grand plan behind every decision or every moment. She simply lived, with the forest, with the seasons, with the ebb and flow of life. One afternoon, as she sat by the river, watching the water flow past, she realized something. The wilderness hadn't just healed her, it had transformed her. The quiet, still moments spent walking the trails, watching the animals, and simply breathing in the air had given her space to grow. And in the same way the forest had weathered the seasons, Emily had learned to face her own cycles, her grief, her loneliness, her fears, and to embrace the changes that came with them. As the first flowers of spring began to bloom along the banks of the river, Emily sat in quiet peace. The lessons of the bear and her cub, lessons of resilience, patience, and connection, had settled into her heart. The forest had taught her that survival wasn't about conquering everything, but about embracing the challenges and moving forward in harmony with the world around her. The world around her wasn't perfect, and neither was she. But in the wilderness, in the cycle of life, there was a quiet beauty in that imperfection, a beauty she was learning to accept. Life, after all, was always changing, always growing, always evolving. And as Emily watched the mother bear and her cub make their way through the forest, she knew that her journey wasn't over. For her, it was just beginning. The forest would continue to change, just as she would, and that was enough. As the sun set behind the trees, casting long shadows across the land, Emily stood up slowly and made her way back to the cabin, her heart full, not with answers, but with the quiet knowing that she had finally found her place. A place in the forest. A place in the world. And in that place, she was whole. As the seasons change and the forest continues its eternal cycle, the bond between mother and cub remains a testament to the power of survival and love in the wild. Their journey is a quiet yet powerful reminder of the resilience that lies within nature. Nature shows us all that no matter how harsh the circumstances, life will always find a way. If this story has touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories from the wild. Join us on this incredible journey where nature reveals its most unforgettable moments. Thank you for watching, and stay connected for more inspiring tales.